Hello everyone, today we're doing a book review on Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. This is a story about a man from South Africa. So, what's so funny about this book review and this book in general is I actually chose this book because so many people have been saying I look like Trevor Noah in the last 2 years, which I find so random. I don't know where that came from. I don't even really see it, but we have similar eye shape, I would say. But other than that, I don't really see it. And Afro, we both have Afros, which is pretty dope. I love that for him. But he's a great man, so to be compared to a man like that, I take it as an honor. So thank you for that. But honestly, let's get into this book review. Before I do get into it, I want to say I actually discovered Trevor Noah in high school. I learned about him randomly in my US history class that we were taking on US government. And this was when Trevor Noah first got the position at The Daily Show as the host. And my government teacher loved that show. And he would put on some episodes of that show at the time because this was around the election period with Trump for the first time. So this was a really interesting period in US history, I guess. So it was fascinating to actually hear about Trevor Noah and his story because he was South African, but he was such a big political commentator in the United States, and him to be on the Daily Show was quite groundbreaking and historic. So that kind of started my interest in him and learning more about him. But this book was just so fascinating because I didn't even know anything about him. I just saw him as a famous comedian and this talk show host. I didn't even know anything about his story growing up in South Africa and what it meant to be born a crime in South Africa and the history of South Africa. So we're gonna get into that today a little bit. So Trevor opens up the book and talks about apartheid. And if you don't know, apartheid was a legal system in South Africa that separated the white people from black people and colored people. It was a racial caste system and a hierarchy that ended in the 90s. What I found really interesting about apartheid is the racial system and caste system that separated people, but at the same time, they needed each other to survive. And Trevor actually had a quote that said, "Under apartheid, the government provided no transportation for blacks, but white people still needed us to show up to mop their floors," which is really, really deep. And he then says how black people actually created their own transit system that was illegal, but at the same time was essential to the economy for black residents because they weren't allowed to ride the same trains, buses as white people, but they still needed to get around. So they had to create their own system that was very much essential to the black economic prosperity in this nation. Next, we have Trevor talking about his childhood growing up in South Africa. So like I said earlier, Trevor is a colored man, and colored in South Africa means mixed blood. In America, we call that mixed or mixed race, biracial, something of that sort. And he actually shared that being mixed race is illegal. In South Africa, there were laws that white people, indigenous people to Africa cannot have offspring or relationships with each other. This was profound, this was illegal, and there was a lot of laws against this that would cost jail time. Colored people in South Africa have a duality in South Africa. Dutch colonists were actually the first to land in the southern tip of Africa. When the Dutch first landed in South Africa, they encountered the indigenous people in that region who were the Khoisan people, and they actually ended up starting the first mixed race people in South Africa. What was so interesting was Trevor actually talking about the colored category. They're a separate category from black and from white. They're a hybrid, something that's in between both, but neither at the same time. And that creates a lot of issues because there's so much complexity and so much diversity within the colored category that anyone could be colored and no one is colored at the same time. And some of the examples that he shared was white people could be considered colored if their skin was too dark or if they actually didn't uphold that white hierarchy. They could lose that white card and be placed in that colored category, which was lower than and had less benefits and prosperity within society. And then black Africans who weren't colored could become colored by having proximity to whiteness and having a lot more money. So this created this weird caste system that honestly was forever changing and forever had so many different rules that were letting too many people in and having too much power. And what was so fascinating is I actually learned a lot more about the colored category and the colored treatment in Nelson Mandela's book that I actually did a review on last year. I definitely would recommend you check that one out as well if you want to learn more about apartheid before it was abolished. Although Trevor is a colored man, he actually identified more with the black people in South Africa. His mother was a black woman, a woman of the Soysha tribe, and he just learned so many different cultures and so many different languages within his multicultural background. And this was a benefit to him. He often would get bullied because he was colored, and just because he was an awkward kid. He said he wasn't the most handsome kid growing up, had a lot of acne, but because he was so multicultural, he was able to move past certain categories and different barriers within society because he could speak to people's soul. And he actually even mentioned how Nelson Mandela said this lovely quote. It's like, if you can speak another man's language, you touch his heart. And this was something that Trevor knew from a young age, and he utilized that to the full advantage. So Trevor grew up in a very impoverished background. However, despite his poverty, he still had a great relationship with his family, specifically his mother. His mother was his longest best friend and his great companion. She was a very free-spirited woman, even though she was an African woman, and in a lot of these tribes, there's a lot of traditional expectations. She broke all those barriers. She was a free spirit. She didn't live in a boxed life, and she, even marrying a white man and having a child with a white man, was just so taboo. But she just did not care, and he found that so inspiring. And that's kind of what makes his personality who he is today. He doesn't necessarily think that you should just be what society demands of you as a man, as a woman, or as anything. You should just be the best version of yourself and encourage others to be just like that. And like I said, Trevor grew up very poor, and he talks about how in South Africa, he said this lovely quote that in America, the dream is to make it out of the ghetto, but in Soweto, because there was no leaving the ghetto, the dream was to transform the ghetto. And I found that so fascinating and really eye-opening. I think growing up in America, we hear about the American dream is to go from rags to riches, but in his situation, it was more of just transforming the community and the village around you. And what I really like about this section of the book is he talks about how people in the ghetto, these gangsters and these quote unquote criminals, are people. You know, you don't just see someone who's a drug dealer like, oh, that drug dealer is selling crack. It's like, oh, that's my friend Craig. Craig sells crack now. And I thought that was such a beautiful perspective, because sometimes we're so quick to label someone for the crime that they committed or the situation that they're in, but we have to remember that everyone is a person first, especially. So we can't just automatically label them that criminal, that drug dealer, that crack addict, or whatever. We have to remember that that is a person with a name, with a story. And honestly, that empathy can really change the world. So Trevor mostly grew up with his mom, because that wasn't primarily in his life. Trevor actually talks about this really heart-throbbing part in the story where he gets to meet his father again after many years. He went through a lot of research to find his father. It was a lot of digging, and he eventually got to meet him and go down to southern Africa to meet with him for lunch. And what was so beautiful is when he got to go travel to see his white father after many years, he almost forgot what he looked like until he finally saw him. He was like, wow, this is the man that I know so much about but know nothing about at the same time. Okay, so next we get into Trevor's teenage years. Trevor was a smart kid, but he didn't try that hard at school because he had so much going on at home. He was very poor. His mom and her husband at the time actually bought a auto shop, and they actually lived in that shop, in the garage. And living in the garage was actually quite hard on him. He had to sleep in different cars at night, and he had to basically be at that business at all times and start working on that business. And learning to work in the business at such a young age, Trevor became, in his words, a natural capitalist. He learned how to sell things really well. He became a bootlegger in the CD industry. He would sell CDs, and he was a DJ. Because he started to find himself in these type of work situations and in this environment, he started to participate in gang culture and live in the ghetto and participate in this ghetto lifestyle. But what was interesting is he talks about how he wasn't particularly a gangster, because he grew up mostly in a white area, suburban area, because his mom wanted access to higher prosperity in life. But he still participated and lived and commuted to this area. And he considered himself a cheese boy, which is someone who pretends to be a gangster, but not quite a gangster, but they want to blend in with the gangsters. Trevor eventually just became fed up with hustle culture, and he says that he realized that years were passing by and he did not make efforts to go back to school at all like he had planned. Sometimes you can just get so caught up in that rat race of hustle culture that you forget that what are your goals, and like, are you even accomplishing them? And he even said that one thing about the hood is that you're always working, and sometimes you feel like something's happening but nothing's happening at all. This was said on page 217. And then later in the book we learn more about Trevor's mother's late husband, who was a very toxic environment, and how that really inspired him to move on and move out of his house and just start living his own life for himself. Eventually, you have to move on and just pick you and do you the best you can. And this was really difficult for him to leave his mother, but because his mother was his longest friend, his biggest companion. But Trevor realized in order to be successful and go after his dreams, he had to move out and he had to start picking himself up and living the true Trevor. Yeah, this book was quite the journey. It was a page turner. I just didn't know that Trevor had this amazing once in a lifetime story. He lived a really interesting life. He really is that rags to riches story, and it's so fascinating to see who he is now, this poised comedian, this world traveler, and a story writer, a storyteller. And, all jokes aside, it's funny to have people say I look like this man, which, I'll take it, but I'm inspired. Like, I want to be like this man. He is just such a self-actualized individual and has accomplished so much, and he's just getting started. But yes, everyone, that is the book review on Born a Crime. I certainly think everyone should read this book. You can just take so much away. I think my biggest takeaways to this book is no matter who you are and where you represent in this world, I think you should always strive to learn more about others. Trevor was so successful because he was so multicultural. He spoke so many different languages within South Africa, so many different tribal languages that weren't so common and so popular. I think the world will be a better place once we start learning more about different people, because once you learn more about other people's cultures, you start to have more empathy and more sympathy for these different types of people, and you start to realize that we are not so different. We are actually the same in so many ways. We want the same things. We just want to be seen, heard, and recognized. And Trevor learned that at a young age, and that's why he was able to really just be this successful young man that was always persevering. But thank you everyone for coming to my book review. Today we learned a lot about Trevor Noah's life, and I'm so excited to see what else he will accomplish in the future. Let me know if you guys want me to do any other book reviews. Thank you and have a great day. Bye-bye.